Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Onboard webinar, Philanthropy in a Changing Landscape. My name is Adarsh Mantravati, and I'm Passageway's Director of Government Strategy. It's our goal through these webinars to provide timely and relevant information to the industry sectors that we work with, and that's one of the many reasons why we're excited about today's discussion. So just a little housekeeping before we begin. After the webinar, we will be sending out a recording of the event, and you will be able to download the presentation. During the webinar, please feel free to enter your questions right into the GoToMeeting panel. We'll try to get to as many questions during the event today, so please feel free to send them our way throughout the event, and we'll respond as best as we can accordingly. So just briefly, as you all know, almost overnight, COVID-19 upended daily routines, the way we work, and disrupted the economy. There have been over 30 million people around the country who have already filed for unemployment, and no industry segment has been untouched. Many of your own organizations are facing significant uncertainty, and you're balancing the obligations to your mission, your service population, needs of staff, and the desire to be sensitive to your donor community who are also facing some similar challenges. So the question today is how the current public health crisis and the economic uncertainty is impacting the philanthropic community. Will the current situation affect charitable giving and volunteer activity? How do organizations maintain donor and volunteer relationships when in-person contact has been limited? And maybe even if it's the question of, is it tone deaf to continue with campaigns at a time when many donors are also dealing with that same uncertainty? These are just a few of the many challenges that the community is currently wrestling with. So today we're pleased to be joined by Angela White, to help share her expertise and provide guidance on navigating the current environment. Angela is the CEO of Johnson Gross Nickel, a philanthropic consulting firm based here in Indianapolis. She also previously served as the Executive Director of Institutional Advancement at the University of Indianapolis. Angela is a member of the faculty of the Fundraising School at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, and often presents on behalf of the Women's Philanthropic Institute. So again, we are pleased to have Angela share her expertise, and with that, I will hand it over to you, Angela. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everybody. I'm really looking forward to the conversation today, and we certainly do want to make it just as interactive as possible. So I'm going to remind you a few times to please put your questions in that question box, and I want to make certain to get to what you have on your mind, and also we can learn from each other that way as well. So I just want to take a minute before we review the agenda to say that certainly today's presentation is focused on the changing philanthropic landscape with regard to COVID. And since the time we put this together, certainly we are facing the racial and civic unrest in our community, and the violent protests and people's frustrations. And so I just want to acknowledge that as we begin. This presentation is happening in that context. And I really believe that generosity of time and talent and treasure is one key to creating positive change for all. And so it's with that spirit that I'm going to dive into an agenda that focuses primarily on fundraising in the pandemic, because that was our topic, but I certainly want to acknowledge what's happening in our country today. So what will we do together today? I want to take a look at how do you stay the course and not be tone deaf, right? Those of you participating who would define yourselves as frontline fundraisers, how do you carry out your work today? How do we focus on stewardship, and how do we ask, especially if you're in a campaign? How are we going to be flexible if we're in a campaign at the moment? Certainly, you've all had your events turned upside down, and I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about the considerations around event alternatives and also how to keep your team engaged. And as I said, I really would love to hear your comments and questions, so please do continue to put them in the question box. You know, a lot's happened even since, as I said, we prepped this presentation. And so I'm also going to share some things that aren't on the screen that I'm hearing in the current moment from clients and working with clients on. So I just want to start with my favorite piece of artwork from the pandemic. probably early March, one of the colleagues I work with, Sister Tracy Dugas from the Daughters of St. Paul, does beautiful calligraphy artwork, and she tweeted this message that generosity is not canceled. So many things in our lives have been canceled over the last 10 to 12 week period, and generosity is not one of them. And so using Sister Tracy's words as our theme, I think the stay the course message is not to be tone deaf, but to understand that your mission will outlast this crisis. Donors care about your mission. They understand and want to have an impact with their financial support, and they're going to make gifting decisions that work for them at this time. So I believe it's really important for you to continue to tell your story, and I'll get into that in a little more detail, but especially how you're responding to COVID, which I'm sure you've all already done, the continuing impact on those you serve, and now your plans for re-entry or reopening. Don't suspend all of your functions and wait for this period to end. We've been in it for a while now, right? We don't know exactly what the next few months will bring. And so we are going to have to continue to modify and create new paths forward. And for those of us in the world of philanthropy who like to try to be in control, I think this last point's difficult, but we can't control it. So we need to focus on what we can control. And I would like to suggest that is our outreach to donors and to prospects. Now, I know we have a variety of organizations participating in the webinar today. You know, there are different implications for our friends in the arts, for higher education, for independent schools, human services. So I'll try during the discussion today to hit on those points, but that's where your specific questions for your particular sector will come in really handy. All right. So let's start with a little research. Now, as I've shared these facts with other groups, I continue to say, no, we do not have an exact corollary to compare ourselves to. If we did, it would be going back to 1918 and the Spanish flu. And we don't have philanthropic records from 1918. So I want to get as close as I can get here. So I'm going to look at what's happened in other times of uncertainty. And then I want to show you some data that's coming out today. So we know in lessons from the recent past that in the Great Recession, foundations increased their grant making. I'm going to touch on this a little bit later as well. We can't assume that all giving will decline in a recession. And certainly the economic times, I'm not saying we're in a recession, but we're definitely in economic times that causes us pause. If we look at giving after 9/11, so in 2001, 2002, over $1 billion was contributed then in response to 9/11. Yet the impact of those dollars on future giving was relatively modest. So for example, there we're saying, okay, people did not divert their giving. I'm going to give to direct response. I'm supporting my food bank today. And so I'm going to cut back my giving in other places. The greater impact on giving was the stock market decline. Yet in 2002, giving remained steady. So the decline in the stock market may not have as dramatic a reduction as you think. And on this next slide, research also shows us that the daily fluctuations in the stock market don't predict changes in household giving as much as the year-end to year-end variations do. So we certainly don't know where we're going to be in December, but let's not assume that donors are making gifting decisions based on the immediate day-to-day changes in the stock market or the immediate impact of the pandemic. And finally, 78% of households that gave to disaster relief more currently in 17 and 18, and those were mostly natural disasters, but 78% of those households said that that giving had no effect on their giving to other causes. So again, donors who choose to support direct COVID response efforts or direct services still care about your mission, and they'll want to support you at some level. Well, that's great looking back, but if we see what's happening today, what are we learning in research that's going on right now about giving during the pandemic? There are a few studies, and I've quoted, or I've footnoted them at the bottom here of the slides for you. But in a study done by Fidelity Charitable, 43% of donors said they will continue to primarily support the nonprofits that they usually support. That's 43%, not, 93%, but 43% said, I'm going to continue to support where I have been. So donors understand you still need their support, maybe now more than ever. 25% of donors said, I'm going to give more in 2020. And 54% said they will give the same amount. You've all had stories, and if I opened up the mics, you would all share them right now about donors who have been so generous, donors who have received a stimulus check and gifted it to you because they said they don't need it, donors who have stepped up at whatever level, okay? And then this was kind of interesting, I thought, in a Better Business Bureau give.org study, that younger generations plan to boost giving this year, as do residents of urban communities versus other communities. So just some interesting drill down on the donor population. And then the graphic here, another donor intent to give in 2020, versus 2019. Again, we get to that 52% said I'm going to give the same overall, 17% give more, 25% give less. So other studies are coming out, practically every other week now, but I just wanted to share a little bit about what we're hearing and what we're seeing out there in the donor community. So having said all that, let's talk a little bit about how do you make sense of that impact. And I know that many of you right now are beginning to set your fundraising goals for 21 and 22, right? And what's that going to look like? How do we plan for fiscal year 21 and 22? If you're an arts organization, you are, uncertain about earned revenue, let alone fundraising revenue. If you are an education institution, we don't know, what school will look like in the fall, et cetera. So how do we begin to plan this? So a couple things I would just suggest if you are in the spot of planning your fiscal year goals ahead. I would look back. I'd look back to see what you received in operational support in 2008 versus 2010. So what fluctuation did you see as a result of the Great Recession? I would also look at stock transfers. So what stock transfers did you have last year from March to December? And of those, what might you anticipate as a potential decrease? I would also add to that I would look at what gifts you received as an IRA distribution. That is still certainly able to happen, but the incentive isn't as great because the minimum required distribution has been suspended for this year. I noted this earlier, foundations may actually increase their giving now to respond to a direct need. If the foundation giving is based on last year's average of their endowment, they are not going to be reducing gifting until future years in terms of the dollar amount. Now they may redirect, right, giving to more COVID direct response, but foundations may actually be a place that can increase. And corporate giving is certainly going to vary by sector, as well as individual giving. And I would pose that individual giving is probably the most susceptible to change in times of crisis. I want to get at, we've had a good question here. Do I have any tips or suggestions for making major gift solicitations virtually? And yes, I do. And I'm going to get to that under the, a little bit under the next section and certainly under campaigns. So keep those questions coming. Well, having said that, those of you on the call who would define yourself as a frontline fundraiser, I want to talk a little bit about what you are doing during this time and what you might be continuing to do in stewardship and in outreach. So right now, the biggest question out there is, when can we resume face-to-face visits? When can I get back to seeing my donors? And of course, as a good consultant, I'm going to give you the consulting answer. It depends, right? And I know that that's probably your answer at the moment too. You have probably already been doing this, but I think it's so important for you to maintain contact with donors, even though we probably don't know if personal visits are going to happen in the near future. A strong lesson learned from the Great Recession is reach out, continue to reach out. You've probably all made what some of you are calling welfare checks, just checking in on your donors, seeing if they're okay, seeing if they need anything. And in the height of the Great Recession, I was at our company, Johnson Grossnickel and Associates, and I did a feasibility study interview in early 2009 that has never left my memory. I interviewed a gentleman who was in his late 80s, and I went to his home on behalf of my client. He'd been $1 million donor to the client, and I was there to have a conversation on behalf of the client with him about an upcoming campaign. So now, height of the recession, he's 89, and we had a wonderful conversation about the nonprofit and gifting. And at the end, he said to me, I want to thank you for coming to see me on behalf of your client, because what I've noticed is that you development people don't think I have any money to give because of the recession. So you've stopped visiting me and you've stopped reaching out to me. And I thought, wow, that is not what we're about in development. We are about building relationships. And so we don't want to repeat that right now just because we're worried about the economic situation. We're worried about our own health. We're worried about donors' health. We need to stay connected. So take this opportunity to do that and to continue to do that. So let's talk a minute then about, how do you make a solicitation virtually? Well, I think if you look at the second to last point here, for those prospects with whom you are having an ongoing conversation about a major gift. So, major gift solicitation has a lot of work headed up to the actual words of, would you like to make a gift of $50,000 or whatever major gift is for you? So if you've been in an ongoing conversation, and let's say that this time of COVID was supposed to be the time where you were following up and you were really going to hopefully close that gift, what we're seeing happen is we're asking the donor, this was the time we were supposed to have this discussion. How would you like to proceed? Ask them, how would they like to continue the discussion? And let's not make an assumption that they are going to say, no, don't follow up, or I want to wait. They might, but how do they want to continue the conversation? And I'm going to spend a little more time on virtual solicitation when we talk about campaigns. But now's the time. Emphasize donor contact. It might not necessarily be closing major gifts, but it might be. And so we'll talk about the virtual piece a little bit more later. I know you are catching my theme here. More contact, more outreach is better. So when you are doing donor outreach, I would suggest you should think about some generational differences when you communicate with your donors. So older donors may be more isolated in this. Call them, send them videos for more human contact, and frankly, budget more time. You're going to be on the phone longer, right? And we certainly don't want to assume that just because our donors might be in an older age bracket, that they are not technology savvy. As we know, most grandparents are on Facebook to keep up with their grandchildren. So even Facebook Live, or again, sharing content there, but certainly reach out by the phone, call them and check in. Now, when we think about our Gen X donors, they're really juggling their aging parents, right? Worrying about them, taking care of them, as well as kids at home. Now, at least most of you, some of you across the country are still in school, I know, but at least we're coming to a point where teaching and doing my job at home, one of those is going to come to an end, the teaching part. But certainly the Gen X donors have been pulled in a lot of directions. So maybe a brief email or a text message I've heard a lot of our clients talking about the fact that they're getting emails answered from donors who may have been in more of a discovery or identification status than ever before. So a brief email or a brief text to check in and maybe set up a convenient time for a conversation. And certainly when I think about the millennials want to communicate with their peers. So text them, ask them to share the message with those in their peer group, ask them to help you get the word out about your organization during COVID-19 and the opportunities and the challenges. I would also say that this is a really good time to utilize your boards. So board of directors, alumni board, advisory board, campaign cabinet, to help you reach out to donors and extend that positive message and see if they need any assistance. Right now, it's hard for our advisory and boards. You know, they're not out meeting donors. They're not meeting physically as a group. They might need some work to do, frankly, to stay connected to you and to feel and to actually be helping. So having them reach out to donors is a great way to move the relationships forward. And then if you're in higher ed, certainly ascertain if you can and should be raising emergency funds. You've probably already been doing this, but you know, making certain there aren't some negative financial implications there. So I think as frontline fundraisers, if you take anything away from that, it's donor contact, and it's also engaging your boards and advisory boards to help you reach out to donors, okay? So I'm going to transition to talking about campaigns. So please remember to put your questions there in the box so that we can have some interaction.
Angela, this is Adarsh here. Before you transition, forgive me if I'm jumping the gun here, but you talked about the donor contact and the value of communication with that network. Can you maybe also talk about the volunteer activity and the engagement or outreach that might be necessary to your volunteer community to kind of make sure that you continue to maintain that connection with them? Or do you anticipate that, generally speaking, volunteer activity is going to decline and maybe stay down even after some of these restrictions begin to loosen?
Now, that's a great point. I'm beginning to read some things, as many of you are probably, about a concern that donor activity will not return. Now, there are a couple reasons for that. So if I have a strong docent program at my museum, a welcome program in my theater, programs in my hospital, at my food bank, right? When is it safe to bring volunteers back to your institutions? Especially those of you who are looking at reopening and lessening the population on your actual sites or campuses. So how do we effectively utilize volunteers when they perhaps can't come to our place of business to do their volunteering? And that's why I think it's really important for us to first of all, stay in front of our volunteers. They are one of your most valued assets. So how do you, just like donors, stay in front of them, engage them to do the work remotely, right? What are the things that they could help you be doing from home to keep them engaged and connected? And then how do you, certainly in your plans for reentry, reopening, how do we handle the volunteer experience? Can we begin small and grow back? Are there other things that we can do? So that is a key piece of this puzzle. And oftentimes I think we don't, sometimes we silo volunteers and donors. So thank you for the question. And I also want to talk about volunteer leadership in campaigns, because those same volunteers have a lot more pull and tug on their time now than they did pre-COVID, especially at the time where many of you across the United States are looking at that reentry, reopening plan. Okay?
Got it. Thank you.
All right. So let's take a little bit about, talk a little bit about campaigns. I would like to say in this section, be flexible, but keep moving. So whether you're in the planning stage, the feasibility study phase, the early quiet phase, the public phase, they all bring opportunities and challenges right now. we do not want to assume that donors will not support your campaign in the current environment. Is your case still compelling? Donors who support your mission and find your campaign compelling might temporarily adjust how and when they give, but why they give will likely remain unchanged. I have seen in our client base right now in the campaigns that we are helping to guide, a $10 million gift, a $5 million gift, several $1 million gifts, and all of those have been closed during this COVID period. Now, part of that is that those conversations had started happening prior to COVID and were closed during COVID. So I'll talk more about that in a minute. But if you're in the planning phase and perhaps you have decided to do a feasibility study, either run that yourself or ask a consulting firm to help you, what we've done is continue to conduct the interviews and just change them to phone or video conference. Not that any of us are thrilled for another Zoom meeting, but they are working. They've been very effective at our firm in donor engagement. And we really believe there's more value to prospects right now to listen to them and to think about with them the focus on long-term giving to a campaign, not short-term. And I would just share here that as I've been talking to prospective donors during COVID, they have been very willing to focus on long-term. So obviously when you're planning a campaign, you're thinking 3 to 5 years out. Now, there are obviously financial implications of COVID that would impact campaign planning today. We'll talk about that in a minute, but more important to have the conversation than not. Now, here's another piece on the volunteer leadership side. If you have campaign volunteer leadership already recruited, keep connected with them. Now is not the time to cancel campaign cabinet meetings, to put that communication with your campaign volunteer leadership on hold. Keep them informed, keep them engaged in your decision making. We are seeing excellent attendance at virtual campaign committee or cabinet meetings. And it's really important to keep them as a part of our decision making and understanding how might we need to adjust and what do our campaign volunteer leaders think of the strategy. So that's really important. I would monitor progress towards your benchmarks. If you're already ahead of your campaign projections, maybe you have a little cushion to buy time. If you're not, how do we either catch up or change the timeline? Consider potential adjustments to the timeline as needed, but keep moving forward, okay?
So, Angela, can I ask this kind of on that same point? I would assume that it's important to reassure donors and prospects that you are continuing to, as a service organization, make progress towards your overall mission. I guess, how would you maybe talk about that importance to provide that reassurance, or maybe how would you advise organizations to maybe convey that ability to persevere, or that they are continuing to have exciting plans despite the current environment to the donors that they're communicating with?
Right, and we certainly don't want to come off as tone deaf. I got a direct mail appeal at my office. First of all, I thought that was interesting. It went to my office because I'm not in my office, but I happened to go in. I go in one day a week just to check on some things. So anyway, I got this direct mail appeal, and it was clearly an organization that was in the public phase of their campaign. And they sent that direct mail appeal out because it was supposed to go out in April, and it had not one word about COVID or how the campaign was still relevant. And so what we've been working with clients on is a twofold message. The first message is we have to take care of today. And here's what we're doing to keep the people we serve safe, to serve those with the greatest need, etc. Here is what we are doing today. And we have a responsibility for the next 25 years, 50 years, name your benchmark, right? We have a responsibility for today, and we have a responsibility for the future. And we are keeping our eye on both. And here's how we're doing that. And so then that sets up a conversation about why continuing a campaign is important, and also how to do it with some sensitivity and not ignoring the current situation. I mean, I'm going to talk in just a minute about what you can be doing today, right now in a campaign, and focusing on current operating dollars is a piece of that. Before I transition to what I would say, what can you do right now in a campaign? I want to just comment on this, not really question, but a really good input that came in that this person says that they're scheduling virtual coffee dates with prospects and donors during odd times of the day. And it's been a really nice break from a traditional Zoom meeting. We just drink whatever's in our mug, and it feels more similar to the in-person meetings. And I think that's a great suggestion. So thank you for sharing that. All right, so from my perspective, what could you be doing today in a campaign? It's a good time, I think, as I said earlier, follow up on pending solicitations. Ask donors how would they like to proceed. I would definitely continue with my campaign volunteer and board solicitations. Again, thinking longer term, but those are the people closest into you. If you are not at the place yet where they have made their gifts, I would move into that, and I would do it sensitively, but those are your closest people, your campaign volunteer leaders and your board. Again, talking about the campaign volunteers, I would work with them on their own timing issues around engagement. A lot is on their plate. I'm working with a client right now where the campaign co-chairs said, hey, we need to take a minute here and think about all the work you need us to do in the next few months, because we are both running businesses that exist in multiple states, and the reentry planning is taking so much of our time. So how are we sensitive to timing around the engagement of our campaign volunteers? If you have co-chairs and maybe vice chairs or other leaders, maybe you can have other campaign leaders step up if your campaign chair or co-chairs need a little extra time because of their business obligations. But I would definitely continue to hold campaign meetings virtually. Obviously, in that case, you're going to shorten the agenda, right? We're not going to have a 3-hour campaign meeting. We're not going to be able to go tour something, right? We're going to shorten the agenda, but we are going to keep people updated. And those that we have been a part of have had excellent attendance. And just, again, be sensitive about volunteers being pulled in a lot of directions. I would focus prospective leadership donors, if you're in that leadership gift phase, on those who have a real passion for moving forward. The $5 million gift that one of our clients received came from a donor couple. They advanced a big portion of that $5 million pledge, probably because of the 100% adjusted gross income tax benefit this year. And they have a passion for the project and they want it to move forward. COVID did not hinder their desire to make that gift, and their ability combined with the desire to make that gift. So this gets a little bit more to the tips for making major gift solicitations virtually. That is not for everybody from the donor side, obviously. And here's what I would do. I would look at my campaign prospect list for whatever stage you're in right now of the campaign. And I would determine who do we have a close enough relationship with to move into gifting conversations virtually. So who do I have that close connection with that we could begin to talk solicitation either virtually or in a phone conversation? And who do I really think needs to wait until we can meet in person again? Now, don't stop contact, continue cultivation, but who really would need to wait? And let's say that you're managing a prospect list of, just pretend 100 people right now where you are in your campaign, or 1,000 people, whatever it is. I would break down that list, and with what is reasonable, I would put people in 2 buckets here and begin to get a handle on where do I think I can move forward and where do I think I'm going to have to wait. That, I think, will give you a clue about your campaign timeline and where you are. So again, if you're in the early stages and you're doing the internal family solicitations, those might be able to stay on track, but you might need to recalibrate your timeline if we were at a place where we were moving more into the middle of the gift pyramid and we had a lot more, many more prospects that we think have to be face-to-face. We have talked with a couple clients who wanted to even maybe do a survey of their donors and ask, you know, when might you feel comfortable in a face-to-face meeting? I think that might be well done in a donor outreach rather than an electronic survey. But the point here is, I don't think one solution is not going to fit all. It's going to be a case-by-case, donor-by-donor discussion. We were in a conversation today with a group of leaders from K through 12 institutions and had a very frank and honest conversation about when do we as development officers feel comfortable meeting with a prospect in person. If I have somebody in my own home who's immunocompromised, do I feel comfortable? What if, you know, God forbid, I actually brought germs to the donor, right? So there's a lot to consider right now in moving back to face-to-face meetings. And I know that's probably not a very satisfactory answer, but I think that's the situation. And so, as I said, I think now is a really good time to try to continue that cultivation. It's also an excellent time to work on strengthening and building your prospect pipeline. Research and discovery. I mentioned earlier that I'm finding from our clients that they're getting responses from prospective donors who might have been in the discovery or qualification category for them. They're answering emails. They're getting a higher response rate. Why is that? Well, maybe because we're tied to these screens all day, but also maybe because the prospects, they really want to know what's going on with your institution. They want to hear how you're being impacted and what's happening. And so maybe think more about building your prospect pipeline of research and discovery while we're working remotely. I've talked about continuing to meet with your campaign volunteers, creating new ways for them to connect. We've had so many just great examples of ways to connect virtually, and I'm going to talk about some of those when we get to events. You might have to consider with prospects a longer pledge period or uneven pledge payments. What if my desire is to make a $100,000 gift, but I'd like to start this year with a smaller pledge payment? Or because of AGI, what if I want to start with a higher cash payment this year? We tend to think of pledge payments in even yearly increments, and I think we need to be a little more flexible right now. If you're in a comprehensive campaign and the annual fund or your operating budget is a part of that, now might be the time to really focus on that and that component of your campaign, especially in the context of how COVID has made a financial impact on your institution. And then finally, I'll just say here on now's a good time. Now's a good time really to evaluate your campaign timeline. And I would say it's too early to make adjustments to that right now, with one caveat. I'll come to that in a minute. I think it's too early by and large to make big adjustments, but I would create checkpoints along my campaign timeline for dates for deciding on adjustments. Now, my caveat here, though, is if you are at the end of your campaign and you were saying, okay, fall of 2020 is when we're doing our broad-based mailing and, you know, the things that we wanted to do to wrap up our campaign, I think you may need to begin today thinking about, is that the right way to do it? Is it better to think about a broad-based direct mail appeal in the spring of next year? I mean, that closing a campaign timeline might need to be adjusted, or you might need to close it early and move into more operating budget support. So any other questions about that before I move on to events?
Yeah, actually, Angela, to the comment that you made about flexibility and kind of the being flexible with your donors on the timing side of things, do you think it's should organizations be thinking about how to present donors with maybe alternative ways to continue to support campaigns if maybe a traditional financial contribution might not currently be possible? Is that something that organizations should be proactively presenting, or just sort of reacting to how their donors kind of communicate to them?
We've had a couple campaigns where donors have decided to gift, they're selling a property. So they have a second home. They have a condo in a city. They're downsizing. They would like to either gift the property today to the campaign, right, to the client, and have them deal with selling it, or they would like to sell it and transfer the proceeds depending on what is the best tax advantage for them. So that's certainly, that gift of property is a piece that, sometimes we don't think about in times like this, but the real estate market is still doing well. So that would be one opportunity. But I think it is really based on the donor and what is the donor thinking and what's the best opportunity. What I have always thought about, and especially today, is if there's a desire to give, we will work with the donor to find the way. So let's get at the desire. What's the donor's desired outcome? And then what's the best way to help them accomplish that? Okay.
Got it. That's great.
All right, so let's move to our final section here, and let's talk about the events that we're no longer having. A really cheery way to end the webinar. There's lots of talk right now about events, a lot of wondering. Most of the clients I'm working with are suggesting that they will not have any large in-person events for the rest of 2020. So, this picture here alludes to the gala with the cocktail party or whatever your event is. We will not be offering food and drink because, the buffet and the past hors d'oeuvres and the, somebody pouring a drink is not going to happen. We're not certainly going to be eating and drinking and wearing masks. There have been some talk. I've had some talk about hybrid events. So maybe if you were having, I've had several clients, unfortunately, that were looking at major anniversary events, 50th anniversary, 75th anniversary, et cetera. Maybe you do a hybrid where you allow 75 people to come to some type of event and the rest of us get to join it live stream. Okay, so I'm hearing a lot of talk about maybe we'll move to some kind of hybrid event. We've certainly seen some great online options, live stream, virtual connections, videos. I had one client that it's a religious organization and they have a major luncheon that's a fundraiser. So they sent the luncheon invitation just like they normally would, but it was an invitation for me to stay at home and have lunch in my house. They included the opening prayer for grace, told me where to log in so that I could sit with my own lunch, kind of like the coffee chat that was suggested. I could recite the grace with the person on the live stream saying grace, and then there was a presentation. So how do we think about new online options, virtual connections, videos? Maybe you could replace smaller events with president and CEO updates and Q&A sessions via Facebook Live or interactive webinars. I had one client who, had been really keeping the key constituencies informed, but was worried about former board members or sometimes emeritus board members, and did they feel connected into what was happening? So that client just did a CEO update for former board. And they did do it in a Zoom call, and the former board members who participated loved it because they got to see each other they hadn't seen, and they were still a part of the institution and they were not forgotten in terms of updates. Those of you here from arts organizations, I think you have been some of the most creative. First of all, we need our arts institutions to give us that mental health break, right? To feed our mind and our soul during such a stressful time. And so I've seen some great things, rebroadcasting live events for me to watch. A couple museum clients where, let's say a curator takes me behind the scenes in her house. What's her art collection? Or the master gardener takes me into his garden at home and shows me what he does in the garden. Or so things that we would not do, right? But we're thinking of new and creative ways to make those events happen. obviously transitioning an auction to an online event, that's a little easier because most folks have been using, online bidding software for a while. But I've seen that happening.
Yeah, no, this is great because we've heard from a lot of folks that as fantastic as video conferencing tools and Zoom are, there is some Zoom fatigue, and so these alternative approaches are ways to kind of continue to have those engaging events without feeling like it's repetitive.
Yes, and I think, the days of giving, I don't know about all of you on the call, I'd love to hear from you about this, but boy, we have seen the days of giving be very successful. So that's not as much of a, you don't have to reinvent the wheel for a day of giving. It is what it is. It's a virtual event. And so most folks postponed them. If they were to be held in April, they moved them to May. There were a couple of our clients whose events were yesterday, but those days of giving have had high response rates. And also the events that I've been tracking. So if it's been a fundraising event and the desire was to raise money from the event, what I've seen with our clients is that when they moved it to a virtual presence and still had either the auction or the give to a cause, etc., they actually met their fundraising goal for what would have been the in-person event. And you also don't have the expense of the in-person event. So I know we use events for more than raising money. We use events to build relationships and make connections. And so it's the opportunity today just to rethink how we're doing that, to be creative. And I think donors are giving you the opportunity to try new things. So even if we try it and it didn't work 100%, we had a couple technological glitches, or, a piece didn't go as well as we thought, donors I think are much more open to letting you think outside the box and try new things. There's still a lot of uncertainty out there, obviously, but if I were in your shoes and I still thought I was going to have my big September event or October, November events, I probably would be rethinking how to do hybrid or how to do virtual. Okay, so it's that time for the end of the webinar to see what other additional questions we have. And I'm happy to take those. And I'm also happy just to hear your comments about, do you think this is on track? What are you seeing out there? And feel free to push back so that we can share with each other.
Yeah, actually, Angela, one question that came in was referencing kind of the board versus staff roles. So they're saying that they serve on a board, and there's a lot of debate between their role as a board member versus the staff. So are you seeing organizations kind of adapt and change that role? You talked earlier about leveraging your board in your outreach. Are boards currently assuming more responsibility, or is more of that being delegated to the staff? Can you maybe talk a little bit about that changing dynamic between staff versus board responsibility?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I think that, a piece of it is how our board meetings have changed. With great software like Onboard, we can have a very good board meeting virtually. But again, it is a board meeting that needs to be shorter in time frame, probably needs to have a consent agenda so that we can really move to the biggest discussion items that have to be dealt with. I've had some clients that have, the boards are meeting more frequently because there are decisions to be made and the staff needs to come to the board for advice and decision making. And I think that even now more than ever, the role of the board chair or president and the staff CEO or president, that connection and the decision making about what is a decision that needs to come to the board and what is a decision that is a staff decision, right? To be on the same page with that is really important. What's the role of the executive committee? And at a time where boards are worried about the financial viability of the organization, is this a time where we use the full board more and not move just to the executive committee? Having that healthy dialogue and conversation is important. I mean, just the topic that we began today with, how is your institution shaping a statement on the unrest in our country, and what message are you sending there? And that's something probably that needs board members to sign off on that as well. But the message about, you know, how are we handling the UPS delivery once we get back to the office is not a board, you know, decision. So the health of your board, I think, is put into even higher scrutiny now in terms of decision making. So I see it. I hope that helps. I see a question here. You know, high schools that are canceling their open houses, and you know, can you do a virtual open house and really reach kids? So how do you make events maybe smaller and accessible so that you can be in person someplace? And you know, that extends to college visits as well. And that's a really great point. You know, can we think again about the hybrid visit where we say, okay, we can have 10 people tonight at this open house, and we're going to be socially distant in a presentation, and we're going to live stream that presentation as well. I think those are some opportunities for the hybrid piece. It is very hard. I really feel, I have two teenage sons. One is now a college sophomore and a high school junior. And I really feel for students trying to make those decisions without that, you know, in-person experience. And of course, I feel for our educational institutions trying to recruit and find the best match for students without that in-person experience that's so important. So I think that, to be really honest, to address this question, I think schools are still trying to figure it out. So if there's anybody else on the call that comes from that environment, that educational environment, that has figured that out or is trying some new things, please hop in the question box and let us know. But again, so many things we've got to try it, you know, and see how we can do that. I think the other piece is utilizing, if you're in a, let's just say, K through 12 environment, how can current parents be helpful? Can you, if you don't already have it, can you mobilize a group of current parents to call prospective families and say, I know I can't take you to the school and I'm really sorry, but I just want to tell you what it's like, you know, and maybe talk parent to parent or even student to prospective student. Again, just thinking of ways to do things that help people make decisions, but in a way that is different than we've done them before. Yeah.
Angela, one thing that you mentioned earlier was the role of foundations and the likelihood that foundations may have the ability to maybe amplify or increase their giving in the current fiscal year. We're currently, of course, many organizations are in that planning stage for their next budget year or next campaign. Mm-hmm. So do you think that foundations, while they might be able to accelerate in this current year, that as organizations are planning for future, that they might have to kind of take into consideration foundations maybe scaling back in future fiscal years, or should they be as reliant upon potential foundation donations in their 2021 fiscal year plannings, or how do you kind of strategize for those sort of changing scenarios?
Yes, I think that as you look out, I think that our foundation dollars will probably shrink as they're on a rolling average of what their endowment spend will be. Now, I also just talked to a foundation leader yesterday, focus group of one, but she said, we are probably going to accelerate our spend. We are probably going to spend more than 5% in the upcoming years because we know our endowment earnings will be down, and yet we know the need will be great. And so probably if I were budgeting, you know, I would be budgeting some decrease in the upcoming years there, but I also would look at what are my largest foundation donors, and I would reach out to them and have some conversations. Obviously, if you pull in a lot of foundation funds, you can't talk to everyone, but you know the biggest ones who make an impact in your budget year, and I would definitely reach out and have that conversation with them. You know, how do you think we should be looking at the years coming up, right? I would definitely try to mitigate my budget risk by having that conversation. I see we also here have a comment from an arts organization that's saying, you know, we're facing revenue losses, salary cuts, layoffs, furloughs, and yet our board is pushing to hire a fundraising consultant next fiscal year. What's the timing and what would be the best use of a consultant at this time? Well, I think it depends on what does the board think the fundraising consultant will do. You know, what would the return on investment be of hiring a fundraising consultant at this time? You know, if it is campaign planning, if it is understanding, maybe if it is screening a donor base and trying to understand where you might be able to increase revenue, if it is moving forward fundraising goals. I mean, what would the return on investment be? And I think obviously I am a consultant, so I'm answering this honestly. It's not always the best and right time for that. It really depends on, excuse me, what the return on investment would be, and also, you know, the optics of that as well. So without understanding that part, it's hard for me to answer, but that would be the question I would be asking. There could be a very valid reason that a consultant could help you.
Yeah. Well, Angela, with that, I think we are running short of time, but I would just like to mention that that question actually dovetails very nicely into something that we're hoping to organize in the very near future, that we plan to hold another webinar likely next month, and we'll have additional details in the very near future, talking about how best to leverage your board in times of crisis, both from a fundraising standpoint as well as a management standpoint, and some of those types of I would say maybe conversations about consulting, or what are those types of debates we will also try to cover those in that next conversation. So please keep a lookout for that. I would also like to mention that Onboard right now is currently providing free access for all nonprofits and government bodies. So this is an opportunity for us to collaborate with those organizations that are providing service to our communities. And this opportunity is available through the end of August, and does include also a Zoom Pro license that you can utilize for your organization. So that opportunity is available here for the next few months. And then finally, I just would like to mention that overall Onboard itself is a board and virtual meeting management solution. It is a tool that helps your organization continue to have effective meetings and be able to help have your strategic conversations so that you can continue to move your organization forward. So with that, we'd like to thank you all for joining us here this afternoon, and we look forward to staying in touch, and we will be sending out additional information about future events. And also, please do look forward for the survey that is going to be sent your way after the event, as well as the recording of the webinar this afternoon. Thank you again, and we hope you all have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.